At 14:47 UTC on March 15, 2026, a routine certificate rotation procedure initiated across Secure Home Systems' primary authentication cluster in Northern Virginia. The process, automated and executed thousands of times previously without incident, began invalidating OAuth 2.0 refresh tokens according to their standard 90-day expiration schedule. What the system failed to account for was a race condition in the token reissuance pipeline, a microsecond-level timing discrepancy between the revocation of old credentials and the availability of new ones. Within 180 seconds, approximately 8.3 million smart lock devices across the continental United States found themselves holding authentication tokens that no longer corresponded to any valid session in the central authorization database. The locks, designed to verify credentials against the cloud before accepting any local command, began systematically rejecting unlock attempts from mobile applications, biometric readers, and numerical keypads alike. Each rejection triggered an automatic retry protocol, and within minutes, the authentication servers were processing 340,000 validation requests per second, a load volume that exceeded the infrastructure's tested capacity by a factor of 7. Traffic shaping algorithms, designed to prevent distributed denial of service attacks, misidentified the surge as malicious and began throttling legitimate traffic, creating a feedback loop where failed authentications generated exponentially increasing retry attempts. By 15:02 UTC, the entire authentication infrastructure had entered what engineers would later describe as computational thrashing, a state where the system consumed all available resources, simply managing its own failure, leaving no capacity to process actual unlock requests. Secure Home Systems had marketed their products with a prominent offline access feature, advertised as a fail-safe that would allow locks to operate independently of cloud connectivity for up to 72 hours using locally cached credentials. The implementation relied on a cryptographic protocol where each lock maintained an encrypted cache of recently validated authentication credentials, indexed by device fingerprint and timestamp. However, firmware version 4.7.3, installed on approximately 63% of deployed units as of March 2026, contained an undocumented dependency on cloud-verified time synchronization for cache validation. The bug was subtle. The local authentication module would accept cached credentials only if the lock's internal clock matched the timestamp range specified in the cache token's metadata. And that clock required periodic network time protocol synchronization with Secure Home's time servers. When the central authentication infrastructure collapsed, it took the NTP service with it, leaving millions of locks unable to verify their own temporal state. The devices, confronted with what appeared to be a time desynchronization attack, a known vector for replay-based security breaches, defaulted to their programmed security stance: total lockdown. Every cached credential was invalidated. Every local Bluetooth pairing was rejected as potentially compromised. The locks that homeowners had been assured would function even if the internet goes down now refused to recognize any authentication method whatsoever, their firmware trapped in a paranoid security posture that interpreted the absence of cloud confirmation as evidence of active intrusion. In the affluent suburbs of Naperville, Illinois, 34-year-old software engineer Michael Torres stood on his own front porch, separated from his sleeping infant daughter by 4 inches of composite door material and a solenoid-driven deadbolt in hard lock state. The lock's status LED pulsed red, indicating authentication failure, as his phone displayed error code SH4701, credential verification timeout. The irony was not lost on Torres, who worked in cloud infrastructure. He recognized immediately that he was experiencing a server-side authentication failure. What he could not overcome was the mathematical certainty of the encryption implementing that failure. The lock's communication protocol employed end-to-end AES-256 encryption with perfect forward secrecy, meaning that even if he could somehow extract the lock's firmware and reverse engineer its code, the cryptographic keys required to issue valid unlock commands existed only in volatile memory on Secure Home's authentication servers that were, at that moment, inaccessible. The digital credentials on his phone were mathematically useless without the corresponding server-side validation. 3 houses down, 67-year-old Patricia Chen, who had never fully understood the technology her son had installed for her, stood in her driveway holding a physical key, a backup her traditional deadbolt would have accepted. But Secure Home's retrofit installation had replaced the mechanical cylinder entirely. The keyhole that remained was decorative, a skeuomorphic design element that led nowhere. The encryption protecting her home was functioning exactly as designed, an impenetrable barrier against unauthorized access. She was simply on the wrong side of the authorization list, unable to prove her identity to an algorithm that could no longer ask its master for confirmation. The first lockout-related emergency call reached the Chicago 911 dispatch center at 15:09 UTC, logged as a possible burglary, a homeowner unable to enter their residence after work. By 15:45, dispatchers across the Central Time Zone were receiving what the National Emergency Number Association would later classify as a spontaneous demand spike of unprecedented civilian origin. The calls followed a predictable geographic pattern, rolling westward with the afternoon commute as workers arrived home to find their smart locks unresponsive. Operators initially attempted to route calls to locksmiths, but within 30 minutes, every locksmith service in major metropolitan areas had voicemail boxes filled to capacity. The 911 system, designed to handle localized emergencies, structure fires, medical crises, violent crimes, had no protocol for a geographically distributed technical failure affecting millions simultaneously. In Dallas, a dispatch supervisor made the decision to classify lockout calls as non-emergency and began refusing to send units, a policy that lasted until a caller reported that their insulin was inside and their blood glucose monitor was reading 290 milligrams per deciliter. Emergency medical services found themselves responding to calls where the medical emergency was separated from the responders by a locked door the homeowner could not open. Firefighters, equipped with forcible entry tools designed for emergency access, discovered that Secure Home locks in hard lock state featured internal anti-tampering bolts that engaged when physical stress was detected, effectively converting a standard residential door into a security barrier requiring specialized breaching equipment or prolonged cutting operations that damaged the door frame beyond repair. The engineering philosophy behind Secure Home's Fortress mode represented a triumph of security design that had become, in this context, a catastrophic liability. When the lock detected potential tampering, defined as physical force applied to the bolt mechanism, electromagnetic interference near the solenoid coil, or repeated failed authentication attempts, it engaged a secondary mechanical blocking system. A hardened steel pin, driven by an independent spring mechanism that required no electrical power, inserted itself into a notch in the bolt assembly, physically preventing the bolt from retracting even if the electronic components were completely removed or destroyed. The design was intended to prevent the destructive entry scenario, where an intruder might simply smash the electronic components and manipulate the bolt manually. It functioned flawlessly. In suburban Detroit, a locksmith named Raymond Hayes, who had opened thousands of locks across 4 decades of practice, found himself defeated by what should have been a straightforward bypass. His drill bits, carbide-tipped, designed for hardened steel, took 18 minutes to penetrate the anti-tampering pin, during which the bit overheated twice and required cooling. The process destroyed the lock mechanism entirely, rendering it unfixable, and required replacement of the entire door strike assembly at a cost of $340 in materials alone, not counting his $150 emergency call-out fee. By 8 p.m. local time, Hayes had 11 more appointments scheduled and had already informed his dispatcher he could handle perhaps 4 more that evening. Across the nation, the mathematics were equally unforgiving. Approximately 8.3 million locks in hardlock state, perhaps 40,000 locksmiths working, each requiring 20 to 45 minutes per entry, yielding a theoretical maximum capacity of roughly 160,000 lockouts resolved per evening shift, meaning complete resolution would require nearly 52 evening shifts, assuming no one ate, slept, or took other calls. As twilight descended across the eastern seaboard, the visual character of American suburbia transformed into something resembling a peculiar form of civil displacement. In the planned communities of Northern Virginia, where homeowner association regulations prohibited commercial vehicles in driveways overnight, families sat in their cars, engines running for heat as March temperatures dropped into the low 40s Fahrenheit. Others gathered on front lawns, visible in the glow of smartphones, some making arrangements with relatives, others simply waiting, operating under the assumption that such a massive technical failure would surely be resolved within hours. The scene carried an eerie orderliness. These were not refugees fleeing disaster, but property owners temporarily separated from their property by an invisible mathematical barrier. Children, initially excited by the novelty, grew restless. Parents attempted to maintain normalcy, ordering pizza delivery to front porches, creating makeshift dinner settings on patio furniture. The community Facebook groups and neighborhood messaging apps filled with information sharing, which hotels still had rooms, which locksmiths were answering phones, rumors about Secure Home's response. By 2000 Eastern, several threads reported that Secure Home's customer service phone lines were returning a recorded message stating that higher-than-normal call volumes prevented immediate assistance, and directing customers to the mobile app, the same app that was generating the error codes that had precipitated the crisis. The company's social media accounts had gone silent after a single post at 1537 acknowledging intermittent connectivity issues and promising updates. No update came. The second-order effects of the lockout began manifesting as evening progressed into night. Hospitals reported patients missing scheduled medications locked inside their homes. A type 1 diabetic in Phoenix, whose continuous glucose monitor and insulin pump were functioning, but whose backup supplies were in a bedroom refrigerator, made the calculation that breaking a window would be faster than waiting for a locksmith and cheaper than an emergency room visit for diabetic ketoacidosis. She was correct on both counts, though the window replacement would ultimately cost $380. In Minneapolis, a home hospice nurse arrived for an overnight shift with a terminal cancer patient and found herself unable to enter. The patient's family, at dinner across town, faced the choice of abandoning their meal or leaving their loved one unattended. They chose to abandon dinner. The patient, asleep and unaware of the crisis unfolding around him, slept peacefully through the hours it took his daughter to return, pay a locksmith $200 for emergency after-hours service, and restore access. For essential workers, nurses, firefighters, emergency medical technicians finishing overnight shifts, the calculus was particularly cruel. After 12-hour shifts providing essential services to others, they arrived home to find themselves locked out, faced with the choice of paying premium emergency rates to locksmiths or sleeping in their vehicles. Many chose the vehicle. The parking lots of 24-hour gyms and big-box retailers that permitted overnight parking began filling with cars containing exhausted workers attempting to sleep upright in driver's seats, separated from their beds by cryptographic protocols they had never asked to understand. By 2300 UTC, Secure Home's engineering team had isolated the failure mode, though the solution remained elusive. The problem originated not in a single catastrophic error, but in the intersection of three individually reasonable design decisions that, in combination, created a failure state with no graceful degradation path. First, the authentication token refresh process assumed atomic execution, that old tokens would never be invalidated before new tokens were available. Second, the offline cache validation process assumed continuous time synchronization, treating any discrepancy as a potential security threat. Third, and most critically, the hard lock mechanism had been designed with no administrative override protocol, no master key function that could bypass security checks in the event of system-wide failure. This decision had been deliberate, made in response to security researchers who had demonstrated administrative override exploits in competing systems. Secure Home's engineers had eliminated the vulnerability by eliminating the override entirely. Now, that security feature had become a security liability of unprecedented scale. The only method to restore access required physical intervention at each lock, either destructive entry or a manual firmware update by a direct USB connection to the lock's internal diagnostic port, a port accessible only by removing the interior escutcheon plate, which was, naturally, on the wrong side of the locked door. Some newer models supported firmware updates via Bluetooth, but that protocol required authentication, which required the cloud servers, which remained inaccessible. The engineering team found themselves trapped in a recursive dependency loop, each potential solution requiring access to resources located behind the very locks they were attempting to open. As the crisis extended past midnight Eastern Time, the response fragmented along economic and social lines in ways that illuminated existing inequalities with uncomfortable clarity. Homeowners with financial resources solved the problem through brute force, emergency locksmiths, hotel rooms, replacement doors. A real estate executive in Westchester County paid $500 for a locksmith's after-midnight emergency call, waited 35 minutes for door access, and was sleeping in his own bed by 1:30. Renters in apartment complexes faced a more complex scenario. Some property management companies dispatched maintenance staff with master keys or bump keys that could bypass the electronic locks, while others took the position that smart lock failures were the tenant's responsibility under the lease's technology addendum. Elderly residents who had adopted smart home technology at the encouragement of adult children, technology meant to improve their safety and independence, found themselves particularly vulnerable. An 81-year-old woman in Tucson sat in her garage for 6 hours, unable to reach her son in Seattle and unwilling to bother neighbors at night, before a postal worker making morning deliveries found her and called for assistance. The crisis revealed a fundamental assumption in the design of consumer IoT security systems that users always had alternative resources, that a technological failure would be inconvenient but not genuinely catastrophic. For millions of Americans on March 15th, that assumption proved false. The door lock, perhaps the most ancient and fundamental technology of domestic security, had been transformed into a single point of failure with no redundancy, no backup, no fail-safe that actually failed safely. Secure Home's authentication infrastructure was fully restored at 0917 UTC on March 16th, approximately 18 hours and 30 minutes after the initial cascade failure. The company's post-incident report, released 3 weeks later under pressure from the Federal Trade Commission, attributed the outage to an unforeseen interaction between routine security certificate rotation and time synchronization protocols during a period of higher-than-anticipated network latency. The report outlined 17 distinct remediation steps, including implementation of a true offline authentication mode, extension of cached credential validity periods, and development of an emergency administrative unlock protocol secured by multi-factor verification through alternate channels. The firmware updates implementing these changes were pushed to all devices by early April. What the report did not capture was the lived experience of the outage, the estimated $340 million in emergency locksmith fees, damaged doors, hotel costs, and lost productivity, the 127 reported injuries related to attempted forced entry, including 3 serious lacerations requiring emergency surgery, the innumerable smaller indignities of families sleeping in vehicles, medications missed, pets left unfed, elderly residents stranded. Congressional hearings followed, introducing legislation that would require IoT device manufacturers to implement offline fail-safe modes and maintain physical backup access methods. The smart home industry adopted voluntary standards for redundant authentication. Insurance companies began excluding digital access failures from standard homeowner policies, creating a new niche market for cyber-physical coverage. But the deeper impact was psychological and cultural. The crisis had revealed something uncomfortable about the trajectory of domestic technology, the extent to which convenience had been purchased through the surrender of direct, unmediated control over the most basic elements of shelter and security. In the months following the incident, Secure Home's market share declined by 34%, while sales of traditional mechanical locks increased for the first time in 8 years. The smart home future continued its advance, but it proceeded more cautiously now, shadowed by the memory of the day when 8.3 million Americans stood on the wrong side of their own front doors, locked out by mathematics, waiting for servers in Virginia to grant them permission to go home.